It is 5:42. Do I have a motion to exit executive session and enter the Finance 101 workshop?
I move that we exit executive session and convene our Finance 101 workshop.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? That passes unanimously. All right. At this time, I would like to call to order our 5:30, I know it's 5:42 workshop, our Finance 101 workshop. And I want to thank coming back again for part 2 of our Finance 101, Ms. Missy Campbell of Spartansburg 7, their CFO, also an esteemed member of SCASBO, which is the State Organization of School Business Officials. We are in the presence of a very knowledgeable expert in school finance, and as we deal with budgeting, state aid to classrooms, and EFA, we're in good hands with our presentation. So at this time, I give the floor to Ms. Missy Campbell.
Thank you, sir. It is good to be with y'all again. Let me go ahead and apologize for sitting as opposed to standing. I normally always like to stand because I can get kind of animated, but I'm acting older than I should and apparently moved around too much, so my back has not been cooperating with me for the last couple of days. So I reached out to him today and I said I didn't want to miss the opportunity because it always feels nice to sit in that seat warmer that makes the back feel better. But I do apologize for sitting, but I wanted to be here with you and I knew that was the best way I could deliver, so I apologize for that. So remember last time we met, we talked about a lot of information and we did a deep dive on a lot of different funds and funding sources, and we needed to get that foundation out of the way before we move towards budgeting. And I told you last time, budgeting is my favorite thing to talk about, but I'll try to contain myself to my hour. But we're also going to talk about debt, different types of debt instruments and debt management, and then we'll talk about a few best practices. And really the best practices, that's really, that's been overlaid in a lot of what the conversations that we've had so far. So to begin with, when we think about building a budget, the first thing I always say, and let me also say this, I'm really focused on general fund at this point. I mean, we build all different kinds of budgets, but the one that gets a lot of attention, obviously, is the general fund budget. So that's sort of the best practices that we're going to talk about related to that. So on building a budget, one of the things when I teach others about budgets is it really should reflect your goals, your values, and your priorities in your district. The numbers really just tell a story. For my district, we believe in class size, and you can tell that in the amount of money that we spend for FTEs, for our salary and our benefits for our people. So, if my budget were to tell a story, it would be that we believe first and foremost to get the most qualified teacher in that classroom and have the least possible students with that teacher. So a budget can also be a tool for monitoring your results. When I look at a budget, I've usually got about 3 years open at any given time. So this past month, I started looking at how did we finish the prior year? So how did we finish for 24, 25? What lessons can I learn from that to see how we're doing in 25, 26? And my brain's already started moving to 26, 27. So I've sort of got 3 fiscal years, and I'm looking at data now to see, how we did. When you think about it, you'll start a budget process in January if your finance staff hasn't even already started thinking about it. And you're trying to decide in January of 2026 how your assumptions will pan out June 30th, 2027. So it's at least an 18 to 20 month window that you're trying to look at. So it's important to remember it's just a projection. We don't know all the pieces of the puzzle, and sometimes it takes us months, if not a year, to understand all those pieces. I said earlier, it should align to your goals and it should be reviewed monthly. I tell my board, our budget is a living, breathing, working document. It's not something that you build and you get to sit on a shelf. I wish that would make it a lot easier. But we spend a tremendous amount of time. When the first payroll hits, I'm already looking at, salaries and benefits and see how did what we thought would happen once those get encumbered for the rest of the year, what were our assumptions and did they work? So again, the budget is really just a plan for your fiscal year and for what your goals and your priorities should be. School budgets are driven primarily by allocation formula, and what do I mean by that? So you have a staffing standard. So for my district, you know, we may have 18 to 1. Our goal is to have 18 students to 1 teacher in a first grade class. Sometimes we may have classroom assistants that go in with that, even in first grade, but we start off with that staffing standard, because you'll hear me say this over and over and over again. No, you're fine. You'll hear me say over and over again, salaries and benefits are 85 to 90% of our budget. So it's like I told somebody the other day, you know, 85 to 90, that's a B and an A. That's B plus level, A level. So if I can get 85 to 90% of the budget right, then I've almost got an A in, you know, and we're doing pretty good. So, you know, the allocation formula that you would have, you'll have your staffing standards. So that's a big component of your budget. The other thing that you're going to have, and most school districts have, is like a school supply budget, you know, things for the schools, where it's classroom supplies and materials. It could be nurse supplies and materials, guidance counselor supplies and materials, but those dollars that are coming from the general fund that support what's going on in those schools, and they're usually driven by the number of students enrolled. So it might be, you might do $75 a child for the number of kids that are enrolled in that school and in that grade level. Those are the 2 biggest pieces of the puzzle when we think about how do we allocate. When you look at all your big dollars in the general fund, how are you getting that down to the school level? The other thing, the second part, is contractual obligations. So, you know, the state provides some SROs. You may have SROs above and beyond that. So you've got the contractual obligations, in my instance, with the City of Spartanburg, with the County of Spartanburg. Your utilities are contractual obligations. So your power bill, your water bill, any type of fees. That's another big component. So you got to figure out your staffing. You got to figure out those dollars going to the classroom, but you also need to look at what are the contractual obligations that you have in place. Some school districts have contract maintenance or contract custodial, so those things need to be built into the budget before you go too far. The other thing would be district-wide policies and practices. So your fund balance policy would be one thing that's important to you during the budget process. You've got a district policy on fund balance, and if your goal is to not go below that, then that's got to be an important component that you're keeping in the back of your mind as you're building the budget. Are we going to, as a result of the budget, are we going to stay within that board policy? Are we going to have to suspend that board policy? You know, how does that impact how we build the budget? And then the last thing, when you really talk about the dollars going to the school level, would be school-based initiatives. Now, what do I mean by that? So we have our formula that says this is the amount of money that's going to a school based on their enrollment, but sometimes you have things that don't have anything to do with enrollment. If you have a school that is an international baccalaureate school, there are things that you have to do for that school and put budgets in place so that they can have the required staff, pay the required dues and fees. You could have other initiatives like a school for the arts, and you may have an arts grant, but that doesn't necessarily support it in total. So the 4th prong of that really becomes past your staffing formulas, past your contractual, past any board policies or procedures, then what are the things that are school-based initiatives that we need to make sure that we build into the budget? So I tried to give you a snapshot of just good general best budgeting practices, and I guess the overarching framework of this comes not necessarily, this isn't Missy Campbell's opinion, although I subscribe to it, but this comes from Government Finance Officers Association, and you're going to hear me talk about that group again when we get to fund balance. So GFOA is, you know, in the absence of authoritative literature, that's the place that we go for best practices, and this is just an overview of what they believe to be best practices in building a budget. And I already talked about the first bullet. It says you got to review what happened in the prior year. I've got to know how I did based on assumptions of last year before I can know how I need to build next year. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. You got to plan and prepare. And a lot of this is starting either in December or in January or February. talking to your schools, talking to your division leaders, talking to the board, and finding out what are everyone's goals and objectives and priorities with the upcoming budget. It's that information gathering. Now, there's multiple ways that you can gather that. Some of it's formally, some of it's informally. I started something a couple of years ago where we really took our goals for the district. We had 4 focus areas that we were very particular about that we thought would move the needle on student achievement. And the superintendent and I talked about, let's base the budget on that. If these 4 focus areas are that critical and so much time and study went into that, then let's build the budget on that. So as we met with department heads, as we met with school principals, I gave them a template, and okay, as you begin to put your budgets together and what your asks are, think about it in terms of the 4. So when they actually filled out their budget request, there was a drop-down box, and you had to tell me which of the 4 goals that it met. It was a laborsome process, but it caused everyone to really sit back and think, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Can we support? And I'm not going to say that that everything had to be attached to that. But as I recall from that year, 99% of the things that we talked about got funded, and they got attached to one of those 4 focus areas. And that's something, like I said, I've been doing this for 36 years, and that was something that 2 years ago, I thought, I go around and I talk to folks all the time about your budget should be your priority. Put your money where your mouth is. So the principals and the division leaders did a great job. But again, it was so thorough. They came in when they met with us. They had data that supported what they were doing, why they needed that, and it made for some very rich conversations. But again, that stuff has to start well before you know what kind of revenue that you're going to have. The third prong is really, again, just setting your instructional priorities. We've talked about that, and just making sure the budget is aligning with what your goals and priorities are. The next prong is really to calculate what kind of revenue are we dealing with. Before we can start doling out how we're going to spend the dollars, we need to know, to the best of our ability, where's the revenue coming from. The local revenue side is a little bit easier early on, just because you can control that. You know what your collections are. You know what you set your millage at. You get monthly reports from the county, and you can track that information. The state side, not so easy, for reasons we just talked about, with the state aid to classroom and how that's being funded. You can be given numbers in February. They may or may not be the same numbers that you get in May when you're trying to fine-tune the budget. They may or may not be the same numbers that you see after the 45th day. Again, we talked last time about that proportionate share concept, and that, as the ADM changes at the 45th and the 135th day, so does the slices of the pie. The pie didn't change, but the slices did. So I will argue it has become very difficult to accurately budget your state revenues on state aid to classroom. I think there will be probably more conversations about that in the future. There was a report that was released that spoke to possible solutions to that by Revenue and Fiscal Affairs, but that's still very fresh on everyone's brain. But again, you got to know how much you're going to get before you can know what to spend. But for whatever reason, the local tends to be a lot easier to talk about than the state. And again, the state's just volatile right now. We talked earlier, you got to calculate those mandatory fixed costs. What are your utilities going up? Any contractual obligation, usually there's a CPI factor in it that you can raise that by consumer price index. But just knowing that and talking with those vendors so that you have that piece of the puzzle. And then I think my favorite part of this whole flow chart is monitor Columbia for impact. I always tell folks, if more than 50% of your general fund revenues come from the state, you need to be monitoring what's happening at the State House. The state budget, it really kind of starts back in October, November, when state superintendent will give her budget and what her budget requests are. The governor will come along in January, and usually through the state of the state around that time, talk about his budget request. But really, where you start getting a glimmer of what the legislature may do is when we start getting House Ways and Means projections sometime in the February range. So it's got to start with House Ways and Means, goes through subcommittee meetings there. It's passed to the House. Meanwhile, Senate Finance is over here working on their version of the budget, going through their committee meetings. That has to be passed to the Senate. And then normally, those two don't match. So you may go to a House 2 version, but either way you look at it, you end up in a conference committee. And that's where 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate come together, get in a room, and by the time they get out of the room, you have a budget that will go to the governor. All of that, again, the governor starts talking about his budget usually in January, but sometimes it's June before we know what that conference committee is going to be. So think, that's June before you know what a large portion of your general fund budget is. There used to be times where I could say, one body versus another. Usually, House Ways and Means was usually the conservative, and if I at least built my budget on House Ways and Means, then if the Senate came along and gave more, it was great. But again, with that new funding formula, it doesn't really matter. It is that gets reshuffled at the 45th and the 135th day. So I spend a lot of time from February to June listening to a lot of testimony and at least trying to go back and read journals of the House and the Senate to try to figure out what's happening at the State House and how that impacts me. That almost can become a full-time job. Once you have the budget, it's time to implement the plan. Implement the plan is just roll those items out, make sure that the things you said you were going to budget, you fully rolled out and are happening at the school or department level. And then the last thing I would say is so important is just ensure sustainability. The hardest thing is when you budget for something, and I said all along, ESSER was so stressful because we wanted to do a really good job with that significant amount of money. And my concern became, what if the things that we did with that significant amount of money worked? How are we going to, sustain that? So, as you're working through the budget, especially if you're funding things with one-time money, we've all done it at some point in time, but it's almost like the ink's not dry on that budget before I'm turning around going, if this really worked, how am I going to work that in? How does it fit into the priorities? And then I put it down at the bottom, but it doesn't necessarily need to be on the right-hand side of the slide. It's really pervasive through the whole thing. It's just trying to communicate it clearly. Numbers and budgets and all that gets tough for folks. But I try and I work really hard, and I work with others really hard to get stuff in terms that the citizens can understand it, taxpayers can understand it, people in the district can understand it, and my role has always been with my board, I need you to be able to cast a vote with fidelity. We may not necessarily agree on which way you vote, but my job is to make sure that you have the information in the manner that you need it to cast the vote you need to cast. So again, this comes from GFOA. I tweaked it a lot for us in South Carolina, but it's just a good overview of pulling a budget together. So 10 things, let's assume you've got that budget well underway. 10 things you can do wrong in developing a budget. And these are just things that I've seen over time from my career. Making sure that you hold a public hearing as required by law. I mean, we have a lot of new people in the state. We have a lot of new CFOs. We have a lot of new superintendents. We've got a lot of folks, and I'm trying to constantly remind, we have to post and notify that we have a public hearing 15 days in advance of that hearing. That's a critical element. And there's actually a prescribed format that we use for what we put with the media. Using fund balance that you really don't have to build the budget. A lot of times folks will try to, we're going to plug the budget. We got it kind of close. We got it within $1 million or $2 million. We're just going to plug it to fund balance and call it a day. But you may really not have that fund balance because you don't know what's just happened in the year you're working in. Using one-time revenues more than once, that sounds like no one would do that, but a lot of the struggles that some school districts are having right now is because they kept using one-time revenues over and over and over and over, and that caused them some serious budget problems. Overlooking something that's small now but could get big later. So again, I've told you, I'm living in at least 3 budget years. The truth of the matter is, I'm usually living in 4 or 5. So if I think there's something that I might hear of now that might not impact me for 2 or 3 budget cycles, I make sure that, that is archived somewhere, and whether I'm there or not, somebody's gonna know to keep up with something that could get us later. So number 5 and number 6, I always underestimate revenues and try to overestimate my expenditures. My theory is I had rather come to you at the end of the year with reason and tell you that we've got a little bit left over that could go to fund balance or could go somewhere else, as opposed to coming to you and telling you that we're short. Now, sometimes it's things that are beyond your control, but I do try to build a cushion into the budget. Because again, there are things we just don't know. And I don't want to say it's all in the state. You can have things happen to your local tax base. I woke up one morning and found out that something that was a for-profit was becoming a not-for-profit. That cost me $1.4 million overnight in my budget. So I try to build in a little bit of cushion for life events that happen. I always recommend that you adopt a budget with some form of a contingency. I don't care if it's $100,000, but just knowing that you've got a contingency. I've before either put that contingency on a line item where everybody could see it, or sometimes my contingency might be in how I budget and balance for vacancies. Because you may have a master's 30 teacher with 30 years of experience leave. Well, how are you going to budget for that vacancy? Are you going to budget a bachelor 10 or a bachelor 0 or a master's 10? So I usually have a lot of contingency in my budget built in. I leave the salary for whoever was there, and that way when the new person comes in, if you end up with a bachelor 0, great. If you don't, and you end up with another tenured, experienced teacher, wonderful, you're not upside down at that point. The other thing is a lot of different counties handle it differently, but making sure that you certify your mill levy with your county. That's something that can cause your budgets to go south. Because I've seen in times in the past, if you didn't certify, then they would use the number that was there the prior year. So I try to remind folks to make sure you certify. And then number 9, I love this one. It's using enrollment forecasts from somebody who didn't have to live with the results. So there have been plenty of times when I'm working on enrollment projections and I'm meeting with principal or district staff, and they say, but more are coming. And I'm like, well, let's talk about your data. Let's talk about my data. Why is there a difference? The last thing I want to do is have a classroom that already day one is overcrowded. So I'm going to give a little bit of grace. It's, everything is not hard and fast numbers, but, my theory is we have a staffing standard, and I like to sit just a little bit below it because we are a growing district, you're a growing district, but it's very difficult to find those teachers in August when a lot of the kids show up that maybe didn't know they were coming. So I live by my enrollment forecast, but there's some contingency and flexibility in there because I want to make sure we're fully staffed. And then the last thing is, and this is true, failing to ask questions and challenge the process. Every time I get a question from a principal, from another administrator, from my board, I learn throughout this process. It may be, we all look at things from a different lens, and you may think of something from a different lens than I did. So I always say, I like to have the answer. That's always my first goal. But if I don't have the answer, then I'm always willing to go back and look and say, maybe you saw something in that I didn't. Again, because we all bring a different lens. So, challenging and questioning is a good, healthy thing for everybody involved. The other thing, again, on a budget is just know what your key issues are and be able to communicate them. So we've talked about enrollment. Enrollment's big. Enrollment's going to drive your staffing. Where are we staffing-wise? Are we in a situation that we're needing to add staff? Or are we in a situation where we need to reduce staff? I used to do a very hard and fast, and let me say, obviously my superintendent, that is where I report to, so I work in concert with him. But we used to have a very hard and fast staffing. If third grade's the place that needed the additional teacher, then we would authorize third grade. We've kind of changed up a little bit now, given our principals a little bit more flexibility. Something else we tried a couple of years ago, see if it worked, great. If it didn't, we'd try something else. But we take staffing in totality. So I may run numbers on individual schools and grade levels, but at the end of the day, it may be that a school needs to lose a teacher or gain a teacher. We're not as much anymore in telling them you need to gain it or lose it at this grade. We're going to supply you with this number of teachers. You know your students. You know where you can afford a little bit higher class size and where you need a little bit lower. So we try to give them the flexibility on that. And then the only other thing on this slide that we haven't really already touched on is just special education support. So, you know, the services that we're giving to these students, it is growing and growing and growing. But your federal funding by which to do that is not. So the challenge really becomes how you can meet those services and meet those IEPs, but with a general fund budget that just may not be increasing at a large rate. So I probably spend more time now with my special ed director than I have in the past because, you know, it's no longer we set the staff and that's good for the year. I think we've already added 4 positions and we're just at the beginning of November because of needs that have come about. So I'm constantly in communication with her. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What can we do? What options do we have? Because that's a growing population and it's very expensive to start making changes mid-year, but obviously we need to provide the services. But federal funds aren't going to be there to do that. So again, I try to stay very close with her. So what should you know about your budget? And I'm trying to think from the lens of a board member and administration. You got to know your local tax base. You got to know what your tax base is doing. You know, are your assessed values increasing? Are they decreasing? What's happening to your collection rate? I do multi-year trends on not only assessed value, but my collection rate. And I'll do like a rolling 2-year average, 3-year average. I don't know nowadays that 5-year average is that beneficial just from what we've seen, what the housing market has done the last few years. So I'm constantly trying to look at, for me, I'm very interested in what is my collectible value of a meal. It's not that I'm not concerned with what the bills that were sent out. I'm concerned with what was paid. So I spend a lot of time on how much did we receive divided by the number of meals, and that becomes my collectible value of a meal. And I track that over multi-years because outside of appeals and other things, that's the one I can kind of hang my hat on. I also kind of track what's going on with the different classes of property, what's going on with my vehicles. So don't do just revenue in total, I'm looking at the details as well, because sometimes vehicles can be up and down. We can have good years, we have years that not everybody's buying a new car, and they're just all getting depreciated. So I'm trying to track that. And even though 4% doesn't necessarily, that 4% homeowner is not necessarily in your general fund budget, I'm still trying to stay keenly aware with what's happening with that population, because as we'll talk about in just a minute, that affects your debt service. I also like to talk, and I don't mind sharing, you know, what my budget assumptions are. So I like to say what increase or decrease in a mill value happened, in assessed value. How am I budgeting for vacancies? Am I budgeting based on the person that left, or am I budgeting based on a master's 10 or 12 or something like that? You know, what are my areas of conservatism? And again, I spend a lot of time on what my enrollment projections are and continuing. I make it sound like I do that at the beginning and then I'm kind of done with the budget process, but I'm tracking that all the way through to the end. The other thing about a budget, I love to do a budget calendar. I love to share that with my board because to me that's the roadmap for where you're going. And I start with, okay, this is the date that we anticipate approving this budget in June. And then I back up and I try to show all the different board workshops, work sessions, number of readings, all the things that we've got to do, get those dates in place, but also include like when are contracts going out, because that's key. We know when contracts are coming back, because that's one of the first things I want to see, especially if we're in a situation where we're reducing staff. I want to know, how can I handle that through attrition? Because that's always the first goal. You know, we put on the calendar, like when are we sending intent forms? Well, that's not legally binding. By the time I get back from Christmas break, I know, you know, it's not 100% science, but these are the positions I already know that I have. An important point of that is especially if it's special ed and you've got intent forms, I want to be able to tell our HR department, go ahead and get those contracts ready. I know we may not have formally done the budget, but if you find a special ed teacher, I want them to be able to have that contract in place as soon as they find that person. We talked about sustainability. It's important to know, what is and is not sustainable. The other thing, I don't want to leave this out because I think this is important. We talk a lot about the general fund, but as I told you last time, special revenue still is very important. So how, especially when you're digging into those goals and things you want to fund, how can those special revenue dollars help us get to that point? And those are in-depth conversations with your federal programs and your special revenue people to say, what are we doing? Do we want to continue doing that? And how might those precious dollars help us achieve the goals that we have? And then we've talked before, again, I can't say enough, staffing, staffing, staffing. Because if you can get that right, you've got the majority of your budget right. I felt like it was important to share this. A lot of times you hear comparisons, and especially y'all, like me, are in a multi-district county, so, a lot of times you're getting compared to your neighbors. I think it's important when you're comparing, District X spends this per pupil, but District Y spends this per pupil. I think these are just some things that are very helpful to remember as I talk about that in my own county. If you're talking about salaries and benefits, we've already said 85 to 90% of your budget. Well, but I may spend more per pupil based on what my salary schedule is, based on the tenure of my teachers. A lot of my teachers are to the far right and to the bottom of the salary schedule. That's where a good number of mine. So they're expensive teachers. So that's going to make my per pupil, even outside of my pupil-teacher ratio, I'm going to look different. I think the other thing that I would share from this slide is, again, when you're looking at your fixed overhead cost and, your maintenance and your utilities and all that, it can have a lot to do with the size of your school. It can have a lot to do with the age of your school. Older schools cost more to no matter what, to heat and to cool and to fix. So that's just a slide that I like to give out that just says, when you start comparing yourself, and comparison's not unhealthy, but just know that there are some reasons behind why you may look different than a similarly sized school district. This slide I used to talk about, it's had various iterations, and then when ESSER funding came along, I hid the slide because nobody was saying I don't have enough money. We had to be careful how we spent it, but we didn't have that. So it's time to dust the slide off. I made a few changes to it and just say, these are just some ideas that I've seen over my tenure working in different districts and working with other districts, is what to do when you're trying to balance that budget and it's out of balance. Everybody's is. So again, we love our class sizes, but we will stretch them. And you heard me say, in a perfect scenario, I like to stay under the staffing standard a little bit, but I might have to stretch it and go over it. And that might be situational depending on the school. We also, I've been known to dig into Power School and look at class loads and see, especially at the middle or high level, how many kids are in a specific class. Now, if it's a class that it's the board and the superintendent and it's the goal to have that class, there might not be 20 students in that class. It might be your goal to have this special AP class. That's fine. That's your decision. But I try to look at some of the others and dig and say, can we at least have a conversation? Because at the end of the day, I don't make the decision. But I think part of my job is to raise the awareness and to ask the questions with the superintendent and the principals and the board. One other thing, because I'm not going to read all of these, I've already bragged on you about your food service program, but one of the things that I think is becoming more and more important is to look and see how you can share services. So in our county, we have a countywide special ed facility, a countywide alternative education facility, and a countywide adult ed. I happen to be, my district is fiscal agent of those, so I handle all the accounting for that, the budgeting. I build like 4 general fund budgets. We do the hiring, the staffing, and all of that. Now, it's a cost-sharing agreement, so all 7 school districts participate in this, and they also pay a fee, because obviously we've got to have the people by which to run the administration of those programs. But, I've talked to districts about, I think at some point we're going to have to get even smarter about crossing those district lines and saying, how can we share? How can we share the services? And obviously, you got to compensate the district that's taking the bulk of it, but how can we get more creative with those dollars? And I think we're just skimming the surface of that. It's easy, again, for a district like us, where we've got 7 districts and coming into that one county, but I've even told county districts, look and see how you might be able to share a food service program. Maybe one district share, and even across a county line, not necessarily a district line. I think the other thing that we've had some success in the past is just looking at custodial analysis and really trying to dig into that, but I also say that you have to be careful. Sometimes when you cut, there are unintended consequences of that cut, and then you find yourself, when you cut too much and too deep and too long, then it's going to come back and get you somewhere else, and you may have increased maintenance. So these aren't necessarily one-size-fits-all fixes. We've also looked at our bus routes and tried to figure out how we could optimize some of the bus routes. Anything. Used to, we're better than this now, but in the past, the value of a brand-new teacher and the benefits was $50,000. That was back in the day. Now, I'm glad that the value of a teacher, a brand-new teacher, is more than $50,000 now, but I used to tell my folks, I'm like, if you can find me 5 instances of $10,000, then we've just saved a teacher. Or we've been able to add a teacher. Don't necessarily take it into the negative. And when you're in, when you're in a situation where your budget's over $100 million, over $200 million, a lot of times people don't think, well, $50,000 isn't going to do anything. Yeah, it will. Now we need more like $75,000, $80,000. But if you can find me 10 places, or that we can save $8,000. And I try to break it down into mechanisms, because when you try to go to folks and say, in order to do everything we need to do, we need to come up with $500,000 or $1 million. That seems large, but little matters as well.
Missy, before we go on to debt service, are there any questions about the budget slides that we've gone through? All right. Well, I gave you a chance to get some more today. Thank you so much.
I told y'all I talk fast. Hang on. All right. So again, those are just best budgeting practices and things that I've learned over a number of years and working with a number of districts. The other thing that I think when we were surveying and things that you wanted to talk a little bit more about was debt service management, just financing equipment. So let's talk first about a bond. All right, so the bond, it has to start with the lender, the person that's got the money, and we're down here, the issuer. We're the ones seeking the money. And just remember, the lender's giving us the bond proceeds, and we're in turn taking those taxes that we get from our debt service collections, because remember, you've got a second millage. You've got a different millage number on that, and it's cyclical. They're providing the money, you're paying the money back through your debt service millage. So I just kind of wanted to go over a few types of financing that are available to districts. This isn't all-inclusive, but these are the ones that either I've worked with or I know other districts are working with. And I guess the caveat to this is all of these start with a resolution with you. So the board, it doesn't matter which one of these, it starts with a resolution that the board approves. And these aren't in any particular order, and we're going to break down most of these in a future slides. This just gives you a couple of different ways that you can fund your necessary equipment and capital. Probably the one that gets a lot of attention outside of a referendum, and I'm not going to talk much about a referendum, would be just general obligation bonds and specifically your 8%, all right? So 8% money can truly be a lifeline to a district when you're needing to tackle, again, non-referendum type things. I say smaller capital, but smaller capital might be an HVAC, a roof, buying technology. State School Bond Act, Article 10 of the state constitution says that you can have indebtedness outside of a referendum up to 8% of your assessed value. This is when your assessed value becomes very important. And this 8% just really gives you the ability to react rather quickly to needs that come in the district. The one thing nice about a general obligation bond in general is it usually carries a lower interest rate because it's got a lower risk of default. Now, why is that? In the state of South Carolina, we have something called the State Intercept Program, which means that a school district really cannot default on your bond payments. If a district looks that they're going to be in default, state's going to come in, intercept that, pay that bill, and then the monies would be held from probably your state aided classroom. I don't know that I've ever personally known that state intercept had to kick in to make a debt payment, but that's one of the reasons that we enjoy the credit rating that we have in the state of South Carolina for that underlying intercept program. So what does 8% money mean? You hear a lot of people say, well, we're going to use our 8% money. What does that really mean at the end of the day? Again, that's the amount of money that you can use without having to go to the voters. So the power is within this board. We talked about the Constitution. So I'll give you an example. If your district's assessed value is $500 million, 8% of that is $40 million. So that means you can have $40 million in outstanding indebtedness before you have to look to your community for a referendum. And again, it's usually smaller items that are part of your capital improvement plan. So I want to scoot forward. I want to talk about this and then I'll back up. Because at the end of the day, it begins with a plan. You got to have a capital improvement plan and know what you need before you can decide what are the things we want to finance and what are the mechanisms, because there's multiple ways that you can finance things on your capital improvement plan. A capital improvement plan can be very sophisticated, doesn't have to be, but if anything, it needs to be a spreadsheet that just says these are my roofs. And these are the age of my roofs, and what's the useful life of a roof, and when is that roof going to, be to the end of its useful life? Sometimes they don't make it to the end of their useful life. They start getting leaks and other things. You start spending a ton of money on patching, and then you start having to say, are my patches worth the patch, or am I going to go ahead and just replace the roof? But the plan identifies what the needs are, and I always say everything starts with the needs. You have to agree on the needs first, and then you can talk about how you might want to finance it. So again, it's consistent plan for the maintenance and the repair and the replacement of those large ticket items. It ensures that plan makes sure that the board's vision is met for what you want for your buildings, your facilities, your technology. It provides a basis to fund your needs. If you take your bonds to a rating agency and get them, rated by Moody's or Standard & Poor's, that's one of the first things they're going to ask you. They're going to say, can I see a copy of your capital improvement plan? And then the other thing is it's got to be updated. It's like a budget. You can't do it, sit it on a shelf. You've got to constantly work with it. And I think the other thing is we do ours in priority rank. So we've got the list of all the needs. We all agree there are needs, but we try to say these are our top 10 or these are our top 20. And we not only try to put a dollar figure to those needs, but we try to say, our goal is to fund this with a bond issue in spring of 26, in fall of 26, in spring of 27. But then sometimes life happens, and something that was a 10, for whatever reason, maybe a safety security issue, it moves up to a 1. So that thing is constantly in flux. But I say all that to say, before you can really spend a lot of time talking about, what are our financing mechanisms, you got to know what are the needs and agree to what those needs are. So I just showed you an 8%, just a sample calculation of an 8% for a district. So if a district had an assessed value of $3 billion, you multiply that by 8%. Constitutional debt limits, $246 million, but maybe you already have some debt outstanding. You take that off, you subtract that, and then that leaves you with a little over $225 million if you're looking at, major repair and replacement. So that's 8% debt. Another form that has become very popular is an equipment acquisition agreement. And you see school districts utilizing this to fund technology, energy performance contracts, and I've even used one to do like a major HVAC unit at a high school, which is multi-million dollars. The nice thing about this is it doesn't affect your 8% debt limit. So it's just a different wrinkle that allows you to either use capital funds that you could use. Maybe you choose to take leftover savings from a general fund and transfer it to capital at the end of the year. You could either pay back this equipment acquisition through capital funds, or you can pay for it through your operating funds. A lot of districts will use some of their general fund dollars to pay for these. It's typically placed with a bank as opposed to think of a major bond market bidding on these. But they have, I can say in my district and in other districts, they have been a nice bridge for things like, again, roofs, HVACs, and we use it for our equipment refresh. So, back when we decided to go one-to-one back in 2014, we used an equipment acquisition agreement to buy the first installment of our one-to-one technology and all of our new Promethean boards. And I said then, I don't know what we're going to be doing in 4 years, but I got to have a way to redo. I knew enough to know we weren't going to back away from that technology, and I didn't know what device we were going to buy, but I made sure that an equipment acquisition agreement every 4 years was in my short-term, whatever you call it, short-term or long-term. I'm beginning to think there's really nothing long-term. All of our needs seemingly are short-term these days, within the next 5 to 10 years. So we made sure that was in my ongoing debt program, so that regardless of what device we bought, we had the money set aside and ready to go. Bond anticipation notes. So bond anticipation notes are just that. They are notes in anticipation of a bond, a permanent bond, a GO bond. They are short-term in nature, so you can only have a bond anticipation note out for 1 year at a time. That doesn't mean you can't have rolling bond anticipation notes, or bands as we call them. We would just keep rolling those along for a year until we got to the point we needed to issue permanent debt. The biggest benefit that I can see from this, when you're in an unknown or volatile interest rate environment, these can become truly cost savings for the district. You may pass a referendum and you don't need $200 million immediately. And you've got a draw schedule that says how your contractor thinks they're going to need the money to move forward. But it can be beneficial to put that money in a bond anticipation note and roll it, especially if you think over time those rates might come down. Wait and go permanent debt, sell that general obligation bond when the rates are coming down. So it's another tool that you can use to try to help put a little extra money during the bond program. While this isn't really related to debt, it's certainly another financing mechanism that's available to schools. So just as you had bond anticipation notes, were notes in anticipation of bonds, you can have tax anticipation notes, which are notes in advance of taxes rolling in. So remember, we talked a good bit last time about timing of money, right? So we may not get good collections on our local revenue till 6 months in the year, but you're paying people starting in July. Okay, and if your fund balance is not high enough, it may be that you need to do a tax anticipation note in the fall. It's just a short-term measure to make sure that you're, I call it an insurance policy, to make sure I don't get in a situation where the money gets tight for payroll purposes. You don't see them as much. Again, once ESSER came along, they became a new normal. But I think as those funds are winding down and people are using their general fund budget and their fund balance, then you may see these kind of come back in popularity. So I showed you just a slide, impact to taxpayer for debt service millage. Again, we've decided the plan, we've decided to finance the plan. 3 things need to be involved in order to pay for any millage that you put on as a result of capital. You got to know the valuation of the property, okay? So you got to know what that property's worth, what's the assessed value for the property. You got to know what assessment ratio that you're using. Is this a 10.5% property? Is it a 6% property? Is it a 4% property? The different classes, and then you got to know the millage. So I gave to the bottom right just an example of if you had a home with a fair market value of $300,000, and it was their only home that they had, assessed at 4%, and their assessed value was 12,000. Well, if you put an additional 25 mills on, then that would be an incremental $300 to the taxpayer per year. So just an example of that calculation. The process, I've been asked about the process for selling the bond. So on the left-hand side, you can see the step-by-step process for what happens when you decide you want to sell the bond. You, again, start the process, authorizing the resolution. Your bond attorney starts working on all the documents that need to be prepared. You receive bids, you award bids, and then you close and receive the funds. And that can take anywhere from 75 to 90 days once you get started. And then I just gave you on the right-hand side just who are the key participants in that process of going through. I had been asked, what is the dollar value increment that you can issue bonds? Well, you can do a bond in $1,000 increments. What you mostly see in the state of South Carolina is bonds in the $5,000 because that aligns more to the national bond market. But you can do them in $1,000 increments. Okay, that was the end of the debt service.
Any questions regarding debt service? Ms. Huddle?
If you issue 8% debt, how does it affect your debt service millage rate?
So that's part of your debt service plan. So if you're issuing 8% debt, you've got to have a debt management plan. That's a great question. And that debt management plan talks about what is my 8%. So start from there. What is my 8% of my assessed value? And what is that to the overall plan? So you could have a plan, a debt service millage plan that looks flat. You could have some that rise based on an 8% issuance. Don't know that I've ever seen any fall based on an 8% issuance, but that's a good question because you can't take it just one piece of the puzzle. So you've got referendum debt that you may be looking at. You've got 8% debt. In my district, we've got special obligation bond debt. We've got equipment acquisition agreement debt that we've got, and I've got one master plan that speaks in terms of if I move any of these needles, then it could have an impact on my millage. So it's a good point to say you can't look at it as one piece. You've got to look at it as a whole. We talk about your overall capital improvement plan. You've got to have an overall debt management plan that, again, any one of those factors change by any amount of money, it can change what happens to the taxpayer and the money that comes into the district. And to me, I would say this, to me, that plan is just as critical. I mean, those go hand in hand. What does your overall debt management plan look like? What is your overall capital and building management plan? And those two have to work in concert so that there are no surprises.
All right.
And then I'm going to leave you, because I know I'm getting close on time, I'm going to leave you with two things. It's not that they only have two things to talk about for best practices. There's lots of best practices, but we've talked about a lot of that so far. I would be remiss if I didn't talk to you about fund balance and just knowing that fund balance is core. When I told you that the bond rating agency would ask what your capital improvement plan is, if they ask that first, their second question is usually going to be, what's your fund balance? What is it? What's your district's policy? What's been your track record over time? So I always say I try to protect fund balance with every fiber of my being. We've talked about timing. One of the reasons you have fund balance, and I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but one of the reasons you have the fund balance is because you don't know the timing of those revenues. You don't know what 45th day will do to you. And just because 45th day has happened, we won't know the impact of that until January. So I'm 6 months into the fiscal year before I know how to react. I've got to have a stopgap measure, and fund balance is a part of it. So I alluded to earlier Government Finance Officers Association. Again, in absence of law or statute or authoritative literature, they become our authoritative literature. So it's not what Missy's opinion of fund balance would be. This is what GFOA says, and it speaks to a minimum 2-month level. I won't read that to you word for word, but I think the goal of that is this is lifted straight from their fund balance best practices, not just for school districts. This would be for counties, for cities, for special purpose districts. This is everybody that comes under that umbrella. And at the end of the day, strong fund balance is certainly a prudent measure of good financial management. And this, I guess, where my opinion comes in, that amount is a local board matter, because one board may feel differently than another. The last thing that I would share with you, again, when I think of best practices, fund balance is important to me, but it seems I can't go a day without reading about something in the news about procurement. So one of the things I was about to say preach to. Yes, I preach to it a lot, is just procurement and best procurement practices. So I tried to give you the 5 top procurement issues in the state of South Carolina and just maybe what a board focus could be, because you've got an administration to handle that, but obviously that's something that we all need to be concerned about, because my theory is when one of us looks bad, it's very difficult for any of us to recover from that. So just weak internal controls and segregation of duties. What does that mean? I think I read recently where there was embezzlement and that person had total control. Nobody needs to have total control. There need to be benchmarks and segregation in your processes along the way to make sure that you've got these stopgap measures. You know, no one should, as I've said, purchase, approve, and pay it. That needs to be split amongst different people. So just making sure that a district has good internal controls and segregation of duties. That's hard in a smaller district, but then you can have things such as compensating controls. P cards, procurement cards, we read a lot about misuse of that and lack of oversight on that. One of the things that I'll tell you I did in my district a year or two ago, we significantly revisited our P card program, decided we had too many P cards outstanding, and the more cards we had outstanding equated to more risk, and finance folks tend to be risk averse. So it was time to revisit who got one, what were the controls on those, and making sure that multiple layers of eyes got on what was spent and when it was spent, and really following through with, if somebody made a mistake, it wasn't just sending a ratification letter and saying you messed up, but saying, okay, how can we keep that from happening? You know, put that in writing to me, how you believe you can keep that from happening, and then the onus becomes on me is to do some follow through and make sure that they really did put the procedures in place, or if it continues to happen, what are we going to do with next level? And I'm real big on the person that approves the card is not the one that was using the card. Non-competitive or improper purchasing practices is just, you know, making sure that we're following the bid specs and that our people, not only at the district level but at the school level, know those rules related to P cards, not P cards, purchase orders and purchasing, making sure we're not splitting purchases, making sure we're working within our procurement code with fidelity. And that is a constant. As people change, you know, you get in a good groove, you realize you've got to retrain and continue and continue and continue. So that circle keeps going. Contract oversight or change order abuse is another thing that we see sometimes. We know what we've approved, but it seems like that creep effect happens, and those change orders can sometimes happen, and then we're beyond the scope of what we said we were going to do. So that's something that we're constantly monitoring and looking at, not only on, you know, construction projects, but also, you know, I've got one person that spends a lot of time on why are we doing these change orders, and have we really changed the scope, and would that have made that procurement deemed not fair, whether anybody knows it or not. You got to look at it whether, you know, the general public doesn't know about your change orders. And then the last thing is, like anything else, you got to test it. You got to go through, and when someone's made a mistake, they'll get documentation from me. It's called a ratification form that describes the circumstances, but then what can we do to fix it? And sometimes it's just a human error. That happens. But if we start seeing repeated offenses, then that's when I start working and diving a little bit deeper, and they may lose some of their purchasing privileges. You know, again, as I said in that closing comment, procurement problems are rarely about one purchase, somebody making a mistake. You know, it's about weak oversight. So we're in constant motion to try to make sure that, you know, we're spending those dollars appropriately and being good stewards of the taxpayer money. And that was close.
Mr., thank you so much. We stand for any questions from Ms. Campbell? Ms. Otto?
I don't have I know you're done and everybody's ready, but I just want to thank you. That was very comprehensive, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come down here and do this for us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I know finance isn't always everybody's favorite thing to talk about, but I applaud you for having this because, you know, again, I told you the first time, if you learned one thing or learned more in depth about one thing, I think it's worth both of our time. So thank you very much.
Mr. on behalf of the district, we want to thank you so much for giving your expertise. We know you travel the state doing this. When the South Carolina Association of School Administrators wants to train its superintendents, they call in Missy Campbell. The SCASBO has also created a mentorship program for CFOs, and just want to thank Ms. Tucker for being a part of that mentorship program, to be able to lean on the expertise that you bring to not only the state but our district. We're always looking for ways to improve, to be better stewards of the taxpayers' trust. And so we thank you for this. You gave us a lot of information that we'll go over, but as we start our budget process, you'll see some of these things reflected in our work. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I would say, you know, I've been doing this a long time, but this is truly what, you know, you get to the point where it's mentoring, because great people mentored me, and that's what brings me a lot of joy.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, there's 3 claps over there. Do I have a motion to adjourn the Finance 101 workshop?
I move that we adjourn the Finance 101 workshop.
Is there a second?
Second.
Been motion and properly second. Any discussion? All in favor? That passes unanimously.